Dear Abby, an agony aunt. Relationship advisor sounded better than love guru, but it all boiled down to the same thing. A teenage redhead bombshell asking him for advice on how to seduce a guy. This has to be bad karma. Maybe I killed a nun in another lifetime. This is some kind of cosmic revenge. It wasn't as if he'd had a misspent youth. If anything, a high school girlfriend, as in a girl, who'd been just a friend, had described him as clueless when it came to women. The notion of giving the Playboy bunny relationship advice seemed like the universe having a joke at his expense. It was an unjust thought and he knew it, but teaching the Marriage Fundamentals seminar was already surreal and this was just a cherry on top. Where were girls like you when I was 19? As a human, teaching Shovanti girls how to treat Shovanti guys was as much an experiment as an experience. There were advantages in being the outsider looking in, discussing the comparisons and contrasts in a weird 1950s housewife kind of way. In a universe that put the gal in Galaxy, it gave him a unique perspective. On the other hand, it made sense for the galaxy at large to be protective of their men. For whatever reason, the universe had decided that men would be rare, and so they stepped into the role of homemaker. Hidden in caves and protected against the wild animals by bands of roving cave women with clubs, and though time marched on, protecting men's coveted asses meant keeping them safe at home. To a point. Marlin Perkins, we need to talk. But like it or not, that was how things were, except in human circumstances. Technology had released human women from domestic roles, and Rosie the Riveter was born. Women stepped into the workplace, and while the expedition had been they'd go back to rooming the kids and having dinner on the table, it hadn't entirely worked out that way. Released from their biological roles, women started climbing professional ladders and breaking glass ceilings. And now, despite the far slower pace, Shovanti men were doing the same thing. Shovanti men had rights and protections under the law, just like any citizen. They could own businesses. Young men enrolled in the Imperial Navy, even if they were stewards. Men everywhere held minor jobs where they were largely out of contact with the general public, which was to say, safe, or in high-profile professions like the medical field, where no one should get handsy. Much. Going their own way and escaping their traditional roles was frowned upon by galactic society, yet men like Bodin were standing up and making their own lives in a fluid, hyperventilating kind of way. And Bodin doesn't just do it, he flaunts it. Which is just as well, because Vadim's grown up knowing how to stand on his own. When Kalira sweeps him off, standing up for himself will keep him from getting eaten alive. Probably. 19 or so and seriously dating a girl who could be Empress? Godspeed, my boy. While Vadim was still coming into himself, he was good with people. Smoother than his father, or at least less frantic. Cooking at human food had regularly exposed Tom to a roomful of Shovanti men, mostly married but all gainfully employed, and that had been an eye-opener. The kitchen was a fun atmosphere between the Shovanti guys, but it was also given over to neurosis, turmoil, screaming drama, and free panic attacks as a daily minimum. Also makeup. While only Bodin critiqued his clothes, they all thought he needed makeup. On a scale of 1 to 12, his best effort at hysterics topped out around a 4, but he'd gradually come to see the obsessive melodrama as a norm. Maybe that was coping, or how they were raised. Either way, Shovanti men weren't hiding in the caves anymore. That made Marriage Fundamentals an interesting, if cringy, experience, but also a problem. Men in the galaxy had reached a sort of proto-Rosie the Riveter status, able to stand on their own, but Rosie wasn't a CEO, and few women in the 1940s would have seen themselves as one. Marriage Fundamentals wasn't going to create a sexual revolution. If the girls treated the boys they met decently, that would be his own victory. Which brought him back to Citri, a normal, polite, and intelligent Urbian girl, asking him about how to catch a human guy. That was something he could do. Sort of. Okay, so let me sum up so we're both sure I understand. It seemed like a safe bet while stalling for time, but Citri nodded, and his mind boggled a little less. She still sniffled, but was wearing that determined myth face that said, "Watch out, Buster, because I'm taking notes and will not forget anything you say." Maybe that was more Miver and Shalea instead of women per se, but it made domestic life interesting. Tom settled into his chair, got comfortable, and came to grips, metaphorically, with the girl at hand. Tshirt clasped her hands, leaned forward and inhaled, which probably sent his blood pressure up to unhealthy levels, and looked at him like he was her personal life preserver. I wish Miv was here, but given I'm the only human she can ask about how to date a human, and I teach relationships, she probably isn't wrong to think that... Tom, my boy, do not fuck this up. You care very much for Andre, who has several suitors, thanks to this season in Vascon. Tsirt's expression was utterly earnest, and she nodded so fast it was heartbreaking. Her ears bobbed back and forth, and he made himself focus. Some of which I understand, and some of which I don't. This season lets women, not quite demand a date, but they can stake a claim. Andre already has a dozen or so, and you're asking me how to attract a human boy's attention to get an edge over the competition? Well, kind of. The season's a vast tradition that lets men socialize safely in a chaperoned environment. It's meant to empower men by allowing them to choose their matches, instead of their matriarch arranging the marriage for them. Naturally bubbly, Tshirt wanted her explanation, while Tom digested the whole business of arranged marriages. They were a given in Travanti relationships, but Vasconian nobility used it with a will, while the nobles he'd met seemed to work on a more if they like each other then we'll talk basis. It's a long form of dating from fall to spring, and the spring ball is when men are allowed to make their choices, if any, for betrothal offers or marriages. Listening to Tshirt explain the Vascon way of doing things was enlightening. In a these are the rules of fox hunting sort of way. There were stringent rules, but while it gave the fox a sporting chance, the fox never won. The rules meant that boys never made, indeed weren't allowed to make, choices in partners until a ball at the end of the season. And I'm holding the ball. Great. No wonder she's upset. I see. And Andre is comfortable around women, which is pretty normal for a human, but not for Travanti or Urbians. He wasn't at first, but... Tshirt blurted plaintively. Tom felt like he was starting to get to grips with the situation, which explained a lot. While he didn't always like the academy being a girls' school, advantages were presenting themselves. Tshirt hung her head, looking miserable. It's just, we're not in the same classes, and we have different schedules. I want to go back to Earth with him, but once Collide joined the crew of the Sea Lance, I feel like I don't have much to offer him. He's always sailing, but what do I say when it's the one thing that gives him a little peace? I had to pull strings with Alantel just to get invited along as backup crew, not that the three of them will need me. I feel so awkward. I even gave him a black eye the first time we danced. I leap over Korova, and can't even take a guy dancing. Alanto is showing him off to all these rich and powerful Travanti girls, so how am I supposed to stand out? Tears started welling up in her eyes again, and he saw it coming before she wailed. And now there's going to be a ball! And that explains ticket sales. Hey now, just calm down. Tom took out his handkerchief and offered it over. He never carried one before starting to cook out human food, but the daily hysteria made carrying one as necessary as hanging on to his omnipad. We'll figure something out. I'm going to burn in hell. I am going to ask you a stupid question because your first instinct is going to be to say yes. You clearly have... Infatuation sounded wrong, and would make anyone defensive. You obviously have deep feelings for Andre. Tom cocked his head, which seemed natural these days. Before anything else, I have to ask, do you love him, Miss Vita? I know men are scarce, but do you see yourself spending a lifetime with him? There were so many pitfalls to being young and in love. Just getting established in work, dealing with budgets, endless expenses in setting up house. An adequate, secure income could make or break a young relationship all by itself. When you were young and in love, you just didn't count on the tears. And while getting older didn't ensure getting it all right, experience let you sidestep some of the pitfalls. Sure, noble girls had it easier. Kalira would never worry about money or a roof over her head, and Tshirt seemed to have her own clan, full of people as a support group. To hear her talk, they seemed to adore Andre. It should work out if they were both committed. I love him so much, sir. She looked at him like a drowning woman. Please, help me. I am definitely in hell. Alright, let's start with the simple bit. Have you told him how you feel? I've met Mr. Sheklasset, and while he's a very intense, determined young man, which was putting it mildly, but human men tend to be oblivious about women at his age, so have you just told him? The utter horror on Citri Vida's face said it all, even before the jumbled protests that she'd die of fright. What if he rejected her? And the litany of usual excuses. Part of the problem in young relationships was all the economic difficulties. But part of the problem is being young. Tom held up his hand. Thankfully, she'd either learned the gesture or got the idea, because the torrent of denials crawled to a halt, leaving her looking embarrassed. That was awkward. It certainly wasn't helping. Okay, so let's say no. The issue is that you want to stand out from the crowd of women competing for his attention at this dance, get his attention, and show him he's special. A thought occurred, and Tom managed not to snort. Hanging on his every word, Citri gave him a look. Tom smiled, wanly, shaking his head. It's nothing. I was just thinking if you could sing. But I can sing. Citri blinked, rubbing away the tears, and looked at him quizzically. Maybe 1 in 4 Erbians is perfect pitch. I got it from my father. Why? And look, I'm in the special hell. Still... Entertainment had been his main problem for the dance, yet once Vadim was invited, the issue had sorted itself. He had explained to Desi, and Desi explained to Clara, and within an hour... For all her polite, retiring nature as Melondi Sandoka, there were times when Kalira came out from hiding. He'd never met the Empress, but you couldn't avoid hearing about her either. The Commandant of the Blackstone, Kamalesh, was a kindly, jovial woman to the public. She let it be known that there was room at the top, and she occupied all of it. Polite as she was, self-confidence was not an issue. When Kalira set her sights on something, she forged ahead like an iceberg, sighting the Titanic. She dragged Desi and the others along in a very nice, amiable manner, and they went willingly, it was true. But while Kalira was still at the age of discovering what she wanted, when she knew what that something was... Yeah, Vadim never stood a chance. An hour after explaining to Desi, Melondi appeared, explaining she was good at choir, asked about appropriate music, and before the casual discussion was over, she scooped up Kaslin, called another girl from choir, and run off with a dozen or so copies of music, appropriate to the event. Maybe it was his overactive imagination, but when he mentioned special uniforms for the singers, she seemed ready to throttle the playlist out of him. So... There's a special kind of music for this dance. The music is appropriate to the time, but it features a solo performer. If you can learn it, it comes with its own outfit. Retroactively, that was the understatement of the 20th century. Still, if he was going to burn in the special hell, it could still be a blaze of glory. What was it with space girls in uniforms? Regardless, she perked up. And this will get Andy's attention? That's a safe bet, if you can... Yes, yes, whatever it is, yes. The tears were forgotten, as she practically hopped up and down in her chair. I mean, it's not, lewd, is it? It's... human? I'm from the sex planet. She's asking because I'm from the sex planet, and from her perspective is a fair question. Provocative, yes. Lewd, no. You want to get his attention, so that's the point. I promise you, if you can learn this... Yes, please. Oh, thank you, I will. Tom sighed and sighed. Girls like this never existed when he'd been 18, and now the galaxy was laden with them. It wasn't fair. Though if this caught on, he might go down as one of history's unsung heroes, to men through all posterity. Though Ganya may kill me. Both were options, but now the historical dance was the ball with a capital B. What choice was there? I'll call Desi, Mel, and the others. You'll need the right outfit. At least that was easy enough. Tomorrow was another day, and he looked forward to getting... Back in the classroom, Tom took the center of the pit. It was familiar now. Even the larger audience didn't throw him, as he pulled up his presentation on the wall screen and launched into the new semester. Thank you all for joining me as we start in on Practical Humanity 102. For those of you auditing the class for this week or here as Academy captives, I take questions at any time. I know you aren't used to that, but I do. But for this morning, please hold them until I introduce the material. And here we go. Things fall apart. The aftermath of Earth's First World War promised a perpetual peace, a return to normality, and time of plenty after years of privation. While a few years ago on Earth, there was an advertisement that ran with the words, "Beautiful, because it's new." In a sense, those few words captured humanity throughout the 20th century. Tom hit the page and the words lit up the screen. Many of the girls cocked their heads. He felt like cocking his right back. With the extra girls, many from the IOTC class, there for the wargame, and the Rhythm kids auditing the course, the classroom he'd shared with Miv was full to capacity for the first time. For those of you new to hearing me teach, I do not do so by rote learning. You'll be expected to think about the material, not simply regurgitate it. To examine what is said, not merely accept it. It was an issue, but the girls in his class had taken a while to overcome their reservations with Socratic learning. The girls in Marriage Fundamentals were either so curious or desperate they dove right in. Regardless, he'd become known for the unorthodox style. The IOTC girls would learn, and since his first IOTC meeting was the coming shell, it was just as well if they started now. This class, Practical Humanity, began around the Earth year 1850. This sentiment began to take hold during the Gilded Age in the 1870s, a belief in the world that promised limitless progress, so the belief came that new was inherently the same as good. Tom flipped to the next image, which had been depressingly easy to find. The title was Old and New in Klamath County, and 3 Native American men in full tribal regalia were there, with the driver of a very early automobile. The photographer's original title had been Savages and Civilization. As captives, Citri and the other Rhythm students were in class, and he caught Andre's eye. A promise was a promise. This is one of the many similarities between human and Shovanti culture, and unfortunately it goes hand in hand with the idea that a contemporary civilization that lacks in the same material or technological sophistication is somehow inherently less intelligent or inferior. This should not be forgotten, ladies, because the universe is vast. Our galaxy remains mostly uncharted and unexplored. There is a non-zero chance that someday the less advanced people will be the Imperium, and even if that does not come to pass, posterity will always look back at us for things we don't yet know. That got them thinking, and Tom took a moment to let it sink in. This fault in our perspective, so far as I can see, comes from the belief in our abilities. We, humans and Shovanti alike, believe in the power of our curiosity and our science, because we see their demonstrable ability to create change. For the Imperium, this belief has been around for millennia. For humanity, this is a relatively recent phenomenon, but true nevertheless. Flipping the image again, Tom pulled up a video of Earth. As it spun slowly below the camera, day turned to night, and the light of cities illuminated the world. For humanity, this came about because the prevailing sentiment about the universe had been one of divine perfection in the harmony between ourselves and nature. The sense that our world was there for our use, with everything in its place, and a place for everything. That got some thoughtful looks, but then the weather of the galaxy was largely untapped. The idea of its bounty still seemed endless. Given the profusion of empty star systems, it effectively was. But then, that worldview started to fall apart. For those of you in my class, you will remember my lesson on a person named Darwin, and the scientific theories of evolution and genetics, because the idea of divine perfection on one hand, and evolution and change, could not stand side by side. To the humans of that age, if everything was perfect, then logically perfection must be unchanging. But if things changed, did the divine plan contain mistakes? He could see Citri's ears twitch while the Shovanti looked thoughtful. While the notion of other civilizations developing in the sciences was not new to the Shovanti, the notion of a singular divinity taking a hand in scientific theory was. The Shovanti had a far different and very personal relationship to the divine than most of humanity. Their deities are different aspects, different personalities, and their own agendas. The Shovanti loved and respected them, but didn't always trust or necessarily like them. As goddess of the sea, Nyosa was a trickster, and once you had a divine being playing tricks on you, a belief in change seemed to be a given. The intelligentsia of Earth started to quietly panic. Instead of a world of order and symmetry, things got messy. And then came Darwin, and everything went out the window. Now, those in my class have read up on the Scopes monkey trial. There were some amused faces among the IOTC girls, but he'd insisted they skimmed the material. The looks were no worse than some of his girls had given him at first. That was the 1930s, but it all started with Darwin. Humans wanted to believe in an orderly social contract with the universe, and it was becoming increasingly clear that nature didn't care what humanity wanted. Andre snorted at that, and Tom arched an eyebrow. It would have made for a good discussion, possibly even a great one, but he had a wargame to hold. This conflict of belief created a situation where humanity seemed cut off from nature. This change in perception was happening even as our Industrial Revolution created conditions that were, frankly, bleak. People began to suspect that a great deal might be wrong. That, just possibly, the entirety of creation had not taken place at 9 AM on 26th October, 4004 BC. That got a laugh, but fair enough, and he let it die down. A calculation from a reputable but overly earnest cleric in our 17th century. 6,000 Earth years ago, the Imperium had already been expanding into the galaxy. It was a curious thing that Imperial technology wasn't so advanced that it seemed like magic, but it was what it was. The warp drives had been slower, and the starships more fragile, but the idea of a cleric from a planet where the steam engine wasn't even a good idea yet making such a pronouncement, it was good for a laugh. Tom offered a depreciating smile before carrying on. Earth's Industrial Revolution, where I started my class, was where it all went wrong. Or right, depending on how you look at it, because evolution was raised as a question. Thanks to our burgeoning industrial base, there was a whole new demand for things like metal. Tom hit next, and a montage of images popped into view, featuring the wonders of the early industrial age. Geologists started digging, and found different strata with completely different fossil records. Well, if fossils in each strata were different, and some were no longer in existence, what did it mean for the divine plan if things not only changed but could even go extinct? And what about things that weren't there before, but which existed now? The presentation originally flipped to an image of a cathedral, but no longer. The picture would have been meaningless. It was a case of explaining such an alien perspective to aliens. The answer at the time was that of a great flood that removed certain lifeforms from the planet. Popular acceptance went back and forth for a while, as it didn't really fit the evidence of multiple geological strata. The idea was raised of multiple floods and so on, but all the while the geologists were pointing out something else, that datable historical artifacts provided more than enough proof that erosion, volcanism and other factors could definitely and scientifically account for the state of the landscape, and a very different time to 4004 BC. The idea of evolution as a rapid force, for a value of rapid, was more of a reach for the Shrivanti, though not by much. Earth was considered by much of the galaxy to be a death world, a landscape so unrelentingly hostile that the development of intelligent life there was considered impossible. On worlds like Shill and Dirt, evolution worked, but without the catastrophic rapidity and unbelievable hostility of Earth. Humanity came along, and clerics across the galaxy were still scratching their heads over Niosa's latest trick, at least when they weren't being questioned over how many men were on the market. Meanwhile, biologists were being asked how compatible human men were, and finding themselves very popular at parties. Then one day, one of those geologists discovered flint tools, early human artifacts, and from their position in the geological strata, it was clear those artifacts preceded any clerical chronology by a considerable margin. And that, as humans say, was that. Tom clapped his hands together, and it went off like a gunshot in the quiet of the room. Most of the girls never heard a gun go bang, as opposed to a quiet zzz, but they jumped all the same. Darwin wrote a monograph called The Origin of Species in 1859. Ancient tools were turning up, and suddenly the question came about. If animals could evolve, then what about humanity? That led to a debate between those who wanted to unite humanity with nature and those who maintained that humanity was special because it was apart from nature. And as you saw with Scopes, politics joined in, because if the religion you were raised with, the belief systems that said humans were special, was a lie, then what else was wrong? There was one thing he loved about the Academy. The girls were young, but they were all very, very bright. Sometimes opinionated, and invariably products of the nobility, but they were not stupid. Stupid did not make it past ale emissions, and while they could be amused at a silly idea, if you gave them the data, they think about it. If humanity was subject to the same rules as any other animal, then what use was a religion that was teaching a lie? And if the major religions had a problem, what about any institutions that claimed holy authority? What about the whole system? That got them. The Shovanti were quite keen on their beliefs and their institutions, and they bounced back from the question like a rubber ball. But it hadn't been an attack on the Imperium. It was the fundamental question of how and why worldviews developed and changed as they did. Lamanna Davari wouldn't show up after class to haul him off to some ice world, though she might give him dark looks the next time she saw him. It really started in the 19th century when, influenced by Darwin, a priest named Malthus reached out to a rather powerful politician named Pitt. Darwin believed that population is limited by substance, that a species will expand but be limited to the carrying capacity of its environment. Tom let that sink in and saw several girls nod. Malthus took this to mean that in the absence of moral restraint, population will increase, and that was an issue. You see, Pitt was concerned about the dreadful conditions from the burgeoning Industrial Revolution and put forward a bill to provide aid to poor workers. Tom let that sink in another moment as several of them frowned. Malthus's argument was that if workhouse conditions were made too attractive, then large families would have less fear of starvation and birth rates would increase due to an absence of moral restraint. In short, give poor people the means to survive, and there would be an explosion of the poor. Can't have that. Frowns turned to confusion and disbelief, even revulsion. The Imperium provided a basic living stipend to everyone. It wasn't lavish, but it was there. Pitt listened. The bill was quashed, conditions remained dismal, and industrialists didn't have to pay out for annoying things like workplace safety. The stage was set for those who fervently believed in competition, that if you worked to prosper, the strongest eventually prevailed. Part of him wanted to drive that home as much as Andre wanted to talk about indigenous rights. The Imperium had improved the human condition, and along with the environment, it has set about other improvements too, like industry. But an educated, adaptable base of industrial workers had been very tempting for many noble houses, and until the reforms, humans had been paid a pittance of a normal wage. And not too long after Adam got married, now that I think about it. After all, according to Darwin, that was why some species were successful and others became extinct. Since it was inevitable that an ecosystem would become saturated, only those best able to commandeer the available resources would survive and increase. Humans became special again, not because of divine authority, but because we developed because of a superior ability to prosper in a variety of environments. Admittedly, by galactic standards, the planet Earth was a bloody hostile environment. The revelation had been a bit of a surprise, though most of humanity had collectively shrugged its shoulders at the news. The idea of being taken over by aliens was one thing, but the idea that the new avian overlords were not apex predators? No one argued over how Imperial technology was vastly superior, but the notion of being beaten by the B-team had really ticked some people off. On the other side of the argument were people vested by power and belief in the established system. Darwin's naturalistic explanation of events removed the purposeful nature of the universe, made it appear that science was simply against religion, and so on, because it turned the accepted order upside down. Now, you're wondering where all of this comes around to our war game. That got them focused. The other thing about the Academy girls was that they tended to have a competitive streak a light year wide. Despite some events like the Scopes trial, the major works of religious authority also had to adapt. Doctrine came to be viewed as allegorical, rather than literal, which avoided the science versus religion issue. Science and progress were acceptable again, but so was belief. which left humanity with the question of this survival of the fittest business. And that brings us to when we start our simulation. Listen up, ladies. You will have noted your objectives in the mission briefs for your countries, but they come with ideological objectives too. You are being graded on what you do, how you do it, and why. This sim is not just a land grab. To a girl, they were sitting riveted to every word. With its cutthroat admittance standards, you had to be on the edge of the knife to get into the academy, and hungry to succeed. Fun was fun, but grades were grades, and given most of these girls knew their princess was watching and competing with them, the IOTC girls knew this was a chance to prove themselves. Tom kept his voice laconic, pacing himself. You see, we started this course around the start of the Industrial Revolution, which jumped almost immediately into the American Civil War. Because of this issue of survival of the fittest, and because Darwin's work gave spurious respectability to the idea of something called racial purity. Remember that notion I began today's class with? That those with more material or technological know-how are somehow better? Ideas were put forth not just of racial purity, but of eugenics. People not only advocated for the sterilization of disease victims, they also advocated for decimating cultures deemed backward. It was impossible not to notice Andre's dark and angry scowl, but he caught Tom's eye and only nodded. This was what he'd wanted, after all. Maybe not quite the way he wanted it, but if some had to come out, then the whole of it would. All the poisons that lurked beneath the mud would hatch out, dredged up and put on display. If humanity had done these things to themselves, well, the Imperium had its foibles, and while less visible to a woman of the galaxy at large, they were no less insidious. The Shovanti girls reacted as well. Genetics was a taboo in the Imperium beyond medical treatments and therapy. The idea of using it as a tool for culling a population. Well, everything old was new again, but when the experiments on humans came to public attention, revulsion by the women in the street had been overwhelming, and the perpetrators had never been seen again. It wasn't a public and visible act of revenge, but it was some justice. Of course, the opposite of all this was a move to reward those people who were successful, people who were individuals of civic worth, and who in power wouldn't like that. After all, if savagery was defined by poverty, then success and superiority were marked by material wealth. Substance and power were self-evidently the best suited to survive. It was a perfect way to substantiate a movement that came to dominate one arena of human thought: capitalism. This was a tricky bit, as the Shovanti were socialists with a decidedly materialistic bent. The Imperium had a 10-foot pole relationship with the Consortium because the Consortium was capitalism run amok, but the Imperium understood it. Capitalism was good because that meant material superiority, and the products of the new industrial age were physically self-evident. Those with the most toys won. Cultural superiority was proven by the trappings of a culture produced. The struggle for existence was formed by successful individuals who improved their environment. That much was compatible with the noble perspective, but it was time to twist the knife. He tried not to take satisfaction in it, since it was an example of going off the rails. A belief came about that government interference in social matters, such as housing, laws for the poor, charity, banking, or education, only made it artificially easier for the non-competitive to flourish, to the detriment of the community. And into this reasoning, a person named Spencer put forth the idea called social Darwinism. Heads cocked, and he waited just long enough to catch his breath. Social Darwinism caught on like wildfire. The government had one duty: to preserve the successful individual's freedom to act in their own interests, because success meant whatever they did was right. Right? For nations endowed with material resources and expanding systems of production, social Darwinism fit right in with the notion of rugged individualism, or the exploitation of immigrants and native populations, depending on your point of view. It was a swing and a miss. The idea hit home with the girls in his class, though the interior girls wore blank looks. Tom debated over pointing out the similarities, or how social Darwinism was still choking the West when the Shovanti arrived, but it didn't fit the lesson. Enough points raised that made the class uncomfortable, and he was about to hit them with more. So let's move on. Darwin's idea also proved particularly popular in Germany. Our First World War ended with the German nation crushed under the weight of acts designed to humiliate them. Memorials torn down, punitive sanctions and reparations that could never be repaid. That sort of thing. Tom caught herself watching Deirdre Shalara. The fourth-year girl was the school's cadet senior agent, and he'd have to deal with her soon. That was why he'd given her Germany. Into this situation emerged a German named Haeckel. And when Darwin was published in German, well, in Evolution, Haeckel saw in evolution a link between the German Romantic movement's search to unite the natural and social worlds. Nature and humans were simply in a constant state of becoming. Haeckel began lecturing on his new idea of monism, where humans are one of the animals and had no special claim to anything. But if humans won out by competition of the fittest, then societies did too. Society obeyed the same laws of competition, conflict and aggression. Nations had to fight to survive or perish, just like any other organism. He wasn't sure what he saw, but if he'd been expecting disapproval, it wasn't there. If anything, Deirdre looked far more thoughtful than he liked. Now, the war had done quite a job of humiliating Germany, and as a result, Haeckel became quite popular. After all, if German culture was superior, it could only remain so by ensuring the survival of its cultural individuality. As such, the individual was below the state. The state was emblematic of the culture, and German culture guided achievements and united the individual. A recent linguistic study on that area of the planet had provided for the existence of a proto-language called Aryan, and the fracturing of cultural roots was deemed another strong argument for racial superiority. Every species had its own language, and the idea of language alone being proof of dominance earned a few disconcerted and confused looks, but at least he was past the worst. Germany saw a tremendous rise in industry at the turn of the century. This success was seen as further proof that free will was destructive in post-war Germany by a group called the Volkists. They united these ideas of imperialism, romanticism, nationalism, and racism. After all, according to Darwin, organisms thrived thanks to struggle and purity. The girls looked a little bewildered, and he saw a couple of his girls fidgeting. One or two moved to raise their hands, but he was on a roll. He promised questions later, so hands fidgeted, but didn't go up. The Volkists believed in the purity of the Germans above all others. Racial purity became their guiding principle, and a new political party would rise in Germany to reflect the belief in hierarchy over the individual, the survival of the fittest, and a biological elite. So just around the same time as capitalism found its footing, and just as underpinned by Darwin's theory of evolution, the fascist movement came into its own. There was one more social movement based on Darwin in perhaps the most unexpected way. When another political theorist read The Origin of the Species, it was once again seen as underpinning all their views. It was by a person named Marx. Handing the Soviet Union to Kamara and Kaslin had been a lark. Giving it to Molondi was out, and putting Zinshiki in charge of the USSR didn't bear thinking about. Marx was impressed by Darwin's belief that the struggle for existence was at the root of improvement, not only as a species but also in societies. For Marx, that social equivalent lay in the struggle of the working class toward the elite. That got a few looks. It was about to get a lot more. Darwin removed the supernatural underpinnings of existence, and change was at the root of human development. For society to come together as one was the ideal. A rising tide of the common good raised everyone together in a communal effort, and that struggle was a constant state of class revolution by the poor against the rich. In communism, power belonged not to a nobility, but with the workers. If the guards weren't nobles trained in social deportment, there might have been a riot. As it was, his class, his girls, had gotten used to his more outlandish remarks because he'd explained the Socratic method. The answers were there if you tease things out. But for the IOTC girls, Strained covered it, broadly. And there we are. Thanks to Darwin, the ideological view of the human condition at the turn of the 1940s was split into three competing ideologies: capitalism, communism, and fascism, all neatly divided along national borders. The disagreement became not about whether civilization could progress, but about what that meant, the methods used, and how materialism counted toward the collective good. Tom pulled up the sim, a vast map of Earth laid over the classroom wall. The stage was set for a war such as our world had never seen, armed with the tools technology had provided and three ideological convictions that were mutually exclusive. Ladies, you've read the rules and you have your nations. The Franco-Italian agreement has just been signed, the Great Purge has just begun in Russia, and the game of Monopoly has been invented. Don't ask. The Earth year is 1936, so let's begin. Any questions? Hands shot into the air.